Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Well, good morning. Now, we deliberately set the coffee up on that side of campus and the talks this morning on this side. And so during the break, you need to walk down there. And I hope you all have your pedometers today and you can get your 10,000 steps. We're trying to promote healthy living, too, as well as everything else. On behalf of the Board of Trustees, faculty, and staff here at Centralia College, I'd like to welcome you to the 9th Annual Summit. The five participants, the five centers of excellence, the Pacific Northwest Center of Excellence for Clean Energy is the host, along with the Center of Construction, as well as the Aerospace and Manufacturing, as well as the Northwest Manufacturing, Marine Industry, also the Homeland Security. I think those are the five, right, Barb? Okay, and this is the first time I think we've had all five together hosting this, so that's quite an accomplishment for these five centers of excellence. So let's give them a hand. Let's thank them for their efforts. And I know you're all here just because of the crab feed tonight, but we need to thank Judy and Bob Gunther right now for that, because you have to stick around for the whole presentation to get to the crab feed. Judy, thank you. And this is the first time we've ever done it here at Centralia College, and we're very happy to host you and to show off what we believe is a beautiful campus. And I would like you to know that Centralia College is the oldest continuously operating community college in the state of Washington since 1925. Not that I haven't said that a million times, but it's true. It's really true. And we've always emphasized quality of education, quality of facilities, quality of faculty and staff. And even in 1925, we had the University of Washington come down and they vetted all of our faculty and all of our curriculum just to make sure that everything we taught here was transferable anywhere in the nation. And it's been that way ever since. And we're very proud over the last 10 to 12 years that on the average, we've had the highest graduation rates of all the community colleges in the state. So we're still maintaining that quality even since the 1925 period. But as you walk around campus, I'd like you to notice a couple of things, if you would. Right across the street are the Kaiser Gardens. And Rufus Kaiser was a longtime professor here. And actually, he was an Olympic athlete. He was at the same time as Jesse Owens, set a lot of national records, a pretty amazing man, but decided he wanted to spend his career teaching botany and teaching forestry, teaching all kinds of outdoor activities to students back then. So take a look at the gardens over there. We designed it so that Every habitat in the state of Washington is represented. So you can find coastal habitat, you can find upland shrub habitat, eastern Washington habitats. Just we took it and divided it up, brought all plant species in from all those different areas. So eventually, as they mature, our students can walk around and get an idea of the different botanical differences in the state of Washington. Pretty neat. We also worked with our geologists to bring in rocks and specimens from these different areas too. So you'll be able to walk the entire state of Washington in about 1 block. So it saves a lot of gas. We absolutely love this campus. We try to keep it really clean. We try to keep the flowers in bloom, and you'll notice that our staff spends a lot of time trying to beautify it. And we really believe that if you've got a high quality campus that looks really nice, the students will respect it. And they do. And it's just amazing the difference, I think, between what we see in other places and you see here. Students really do treat it with respect, and we love it. Take a look at the different artwork around campus as you get the opportunity. These murals up here, some of you might remember they resided in the legislature in the early 1980s, and these are the labors of Hercules. And there was a lot of controversy over them, and when we built this building, we just happened to build panels that fit those exactly, and then we petitioned the general administration to get them put here. And there was some uproar. I mean, you have to take a good solid look at them, but they're pretty amazing. And you want to learn a little bit more about the history. And the Alden Mason murals over in the library, if you get a chance, stop in there and take a look. Same thing, they were in the Senate chambers. If you take a look at some of the artwork around our buildings, it's absolutely amazing. And the newest addition, we have a statue of 2 ladies, Catherine Kemp and Margaret Corbett. This theater is named after Margaret Corbett. They say those 2 ladies were amazing. Margaret Corbett was essentially the president or principal, they called him back then, of the college for well over 25 years. She saved the college during the Depression, got down to 2 or 3 students. They gave faculty IOUs. Back during the war, got down to just a few students. And again, those 2 ladies stepped up and saved this college. So we owe a huge debt of gratitude, and we just dedicated their statue this last week. So pretty amazing. But spend some time here on the campus, take a look around. And if you have any extra time or extra money, please don't hesitate to visit the downtown Centralia, our historic train station, all of our antique malls. We have probably 300 different antique stores here in town. And of course the outlet malls. You got to stop on the way out of town to visit the outlet malls. Everybody knows those. But this is a beautiful place. I welcome you. I hope for those of you that this is the first time you've been here, take some time, look around. And for those of you that have been, welcome back. We do appreciate you being here, and I hope you have a great 2 days. So thank you and welcome.
Good morning. So what Jim didn't say, while this is a happy day, this is also a sad day here for us. So this is Jim's last official duty as president of Centralia College. He is retiring probably next week, right? So give him a round of applause. I've always said there isn't a president in the state of Washington in the community college system and 34 colleges that have been so supportive of the centers of excellence. So thanks, Jim. We're really going to miss you. I don't know. We'll have to start all over next year with year 10. So 9 years. Can you believe it? Is there anybody here that's been to all 9 summits? Judy Gunther, I knew Bob Gunther. Not only did they attend, but they worked. They were all cooking crab yesterday, getting the food ready. But this year is a little different. As Jim mentioned, we have 5 centers of excellence participating. We have 10 centers. So this is the first time ever in the history, the 10-year history of the centers, that there have been 5 centers participating in an event. So I want to thank them all, and I want you to stand up. Mary Kay Bredesen, Center of Excellence for Aerospace and Advanced Manufacturing. Linda Criar, where's Linda? Homeland Security. And Avery, I think, is stuck in traffic. And Shayna Peshik is in the delivery room with her daughter-in-law as we speak. So I told her, don't worry, we'll get through this. That's more important. She sent a text and she said, tell them I'm working in the future workforce right now. So how many of you here, if you are a member of an advisory board of any of those centers, would you please stand? These are the people that really drive the centers, our industry and labor partners. And without them, we couldn't do what we do. We wouldn't know that we're doing the best practices. Sometimes we're doing them. We don't even know we're doing them, but they do. So that's what matters. So we have a little tradition. So first of all, how many of you are from community colleges across the state? Awesome. So on the count of 3, yell out your college, okay? 1, 2, 3. Let's do it again. That was a little weak. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Awesome. Okay, you guys are great. All right, so this morning, all day today, we have a great venue, really pretty much organized by Alan Hardcastle and Sally Zager-Hansen. At Christmas, in my family room, this idea was born. So we've carried it out through the last few months. Great summit planning team. Thank you to you. Raise your hand if you're part of the summit planning team. This group has met religiously since Christmas. And again, we couldn't do it without them. So one more thing Jim didn't mention. So Travis and John, where are you? Okay, stand up. These are really, truly our heroes today. So what he didn't mention in the Knoll Outdoor Learning Lab is our little outdoor learning energy lab. So that is an energy ball out there, wind turbine connected, grid connected, Centralia City Light. I think I saw somebody come in, or if not, they'll be here later, as well as our solar panels. So we are a green energy producing campus because of these 2 students that are now juniors, almost seniors, right, at WSU engineering program in Vancouver. So we're really proud of you guys. Thanks. They literally designed that project from design through carrying it through, and now as their senior project, they're upgrading it to a minute-by-minute reading. So it's just been amazing, really fun. Okay, so we're on with the show. So Yoram, you want to come on up? We're going to turn this over to our keynote speaker, Yoram Bauman. Yoram is an environmental economist who is part of the carbonwashington.org effort to bring a revenue-neutral carbon tax to the Washington state. He is the co-author of 2-volume cartoon introductions to economics, the forthcoming cartoon Introduction to Climate Change, and the 1998 book Tax Shift. Come on up, Yoram. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let's see. It is a pleasure to be with all of you here this morning. Does the mic work okay? Great. What was not mentioned in the introduction is that I also appear before you this morning as the world's first and only stand-up economist. Thank you. So maybe I'll start with a little bit of comedy since the coffee is in the other building. I really only have one thing going for me as a stand-up economist, and that's low expectations. But you know what? When Alan and company invited me to come and join you this morning, I think pretty much the only instructions they gave me were that I should try not to offend anybody. So I figured I would start with some jokes about politics. Now, I like to tell jokes about politics that appeal to people across the political spectrum. This is a difficult thing to do where I live in Seattle, because in Seattle there's no political spectrum. I don't know if it's any better in this crowd here, but I'm actually going to do with you the same thing that I do with the crowds in Seattle, the same thing I do when I talk at like the Florida Bankers Association or the Barry Goldwater Institute in Phoenix, Arizona, or the trucking executives I spoke with on the banks of the Arkansas River. That was a story. I'm going to divide you up across the political spectrum. So this is audience participation. I know it's early in the morning, but audience participation is the way most people think about politics is left-wing and right-wing. So I'm going to divide you up kind of right down here. And for the next couple of minutes, you folks here on my left, audience participation on my left for the next couple of minutes, you all get to represent the left wing of the American political spectrum. That was actually a perfect amount of enthusiasm for the left wing of the American political spectrum. All right, you folks are on the right. Come on, you all to come through for me. You all are my right wing. That was better right wing. But when I did this in Texas last month, they started chanting USA. Come on, I want you to for me. Come on, you all are my right wing. Come on, USA, USA, USA. Yeah, that was okay, right wing. That was all right. You folks over here on the left, though, you all were perfect. No, because all the right wing was chanting USA, you were just sitting there looking befuddled and vaguely unpatriotic. Now, that's how most people think about politics as left-wing or right-wing. But if you think about economics or political science, what we call median voter theory, that actually leaves out the most important part of the American political spectrum. The left wing is actually over there, and the right wing is over here, and you all kind of near the aisle, you all get to represent the most important part of the American political spectrum. Too much enthusiasm, ma'am. Calm down. You all get to be my swing voters. All right. Now, a couple of very important things about swing voters. All right. First of all, in America, there are a lot of swing voters. All right. If you are not a communist or a fascist, then you are probably a swing voter. And if you do not know the difference between communists and fascists, then you are definitely a swing voter. Now, your job, swing voters, when it comes to politics and current events, extremely important, swing voters. Your job is to pay absolutely no attention whatsoever. You got that covered? And then every 4 years, you determine the fate of the free world. I know that sounds like a big responsibility, okay, but trust me, don't give it a second thought. And that's really how the political spectrum is divided. You got the left wing. The stereotype about the left wing is that the left wing is spineless. See, they just take it. They're like, yeah, we're spineless. Good work, left wing. You got the left wing is spineless. You got the right wing is heartless. And you got the center is clueless. Clueless and apathetic. And you're so clueless, you don't know what apathetic means. And you're so apathetic, you can't be bothered to look it up. I will explain that joke to you later. Now, there are also, of course, the extremes of the American political spectrum. On the far right of the American political spectrum, just folks against the aisle here on the far right. Yes, hello, you all on the far right. You all get to be my libertarians. That's cool. You can do what you want. Far left of the American political spectrum, folks over here on the far left, you all on the far left get to be my libertarians. You're not supposed to get that joke, sir. No, I did this once, and there was a fellow sitting in the middle who was like, libertarians? You mean the people that check books out for me? And I had to clarify that libertarians are freedom lovers, right? They come in two flavors. You got right-wing libertarians. They want everybody to be free to use guns. You can move if you'd like, sir. You got left-wing libertarians. They want everybody to be free to use drugs. Now, both wings of the Libertarian Party want to abolish Social Security and Medicare, right, which makes total sense, okay? Because who's going to make it to 65? When the world is full of meth fiends with machine guns. That was too smart of a comment, sir. I've been thinking a lot about politics lately because I was in China in 2011. I lived in China for 5 months, and it had been my first time in China. And I didn't really know what to expect. I wanted to have something to say in case the Chinese people came up to me and said, you know, tell me about democracy. That didn't happen. Instead, I went to China, and the Chinese people came up to me, and they said, tell me about your budget deficit. Right? And I had to say, let me tell you about democracy. And I know when it comes to the budget deficit, the left blames the right and the right blames the left, but I actually blame the center. And I don't think we have a budget deficit because left-wing people believe in mandates or because right-wing people believe in markets. We have a budget deficit because people in the middle believe in magic. No, I don't know who you are, sir, but I love you. Let me explain, all right? Every time a left-wing politician says, hey, I've got a great idea for a road or a school or a hospital, the response from swing voters is like, yeah, let's do that. All right, and then every time a right-wing politician says taxes are too high and we should cut taxes, the response from swing voters is like, yeah, let's do that. Right? And then it turns out we have a budget deficit, and swing voters blame the politicians, which is kind of ridiculous, right? I mean, this is kind of like going to the doctor for your checkup, and the doctor tells you that you've been putting on weight. And the left side of your brain says, I guess I better exercise more. And the right side of your brain says, I guess I better stop eating so many donuts. And the middle part of your brain says, I guess I better get a new doctor. Right? Like, it doesn't work that way. Before we go any further, I should show you my T-shirt. It's my you have a round of applause for capitalism. That's cool. It's my Enjoy Capitalism T-shirt. I'm being heckled at the construction summit. What's that, sir? Oh, you're allowed to heckle me because you're laughing like crazy. That's cool. Yes. So my Enjoy Capitalism T-shirt, made in China. If you look at the tag on the back, it's actually made out of 80% cotton and 20% irony. Dry clean only. I actually did live in China. I figured if I was going to work on climate change issues, which is what I work on when I do serious economics stuff, I should know something about China. So I got a position in China. I want to show you the place where I lived in. I lived in a housing complex in China that houses 400,000 people. This is a view from my apartment window. 400,000 people, and I was one of 2 non-Chinese people who lived there. It was me and the guy that everybody there referred to as the black guy. And then one day I was walking down the street to the bus stop, and I saw a black guy. And I kind of lost my sense of propriety. Like, I'm not super proud of this, but I sort of stared at him a little bit, and finally I walked up to him and I said, "Excuse me," I said, "you must be the..." But before I could get the words out, he looked at me and he said, "Excuse me," he said, "you must be the white guy." Like, sure enough, I was the white guy, he was the black guy. He was there from Ghana, he was there on a scholarship, super nice guy. We went to McDonald's, we had lunch. International sign of friendship. I tell that joke partly because if you think about if you divide the world up, this is very, very rough terms. Very rough terms. If you divide the people in the world up, the 7 billion people in the world, into 5 population chunks, into 5 people, you get 1 black person, 1 white person, and 3 Asian people. Right? So there's a lot of people in Asia, and they're going to be driving a lot of what's going to happen with climate change over the course of this century. So so this is why I went to China. So again, this was the view from my apartment window. About 5% of the time it looked like this. Much more often the view from my apartment window looked like, next slide, please. Looked like that. Yeah, so still some pretty serious pollution problems in China. So these pollution problems are not the same thing as climate change, right? Local air pollution, sulfur dioxide, stuff like that is not the same thing as carbon dioxide and global air pollution, but they're related to each other, right? A lot of them are related to fossil fuel emissions. So I'm going to be serious for the next few minutes and give you my climate change pitch, and then hopefully we'll have a couple more minutes at the end for me to tell you some more jokes. So I'm going to do with you actually the same. I actually make a living doing stand-up comedy about economics. I do a lot of colleges and corporate events, and I'm going to do with you the same pitch that I do with them. And it starts with, next slide, please. Next slide. It starts with this fact that carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are going up. Nobody really doubts this. Nobody doubts that this is primarily caused by human activity, principally burning fossil fuels and deforestation. Then, next slide, we have this theory that says that if carbon concentrations go up, then global temperatures are going to go up. This theory actually predates Al Gore. They laughed at that joke more in Texas. It goes all the way back to this fellow, Arrhenius, who was a chemist in Sweden, and in 1896, he made the first estimate of how much global temperatures would increase if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, which we're on track to do kind of the middle of this century. And his estimate from 1896, about 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, is still pretty close to the range that climate scientists talk about today. The big difference between where he was then and where we are now is that he thought that climate change was going to be awesome because he lived in Sweden. And we tend to be a little more concerned about changing the basic functionings of planet Earth. In any case, we've been running this experiment on planet Earth for the last 150 years or so. And next slide, here are the results of the experiment. So the blue dots are individual years, and the red bars are 10-year average temperatures going up, starting in the 1880s, going up through the 1970s, and then next slide, here's the 1980s, next slide, here's the 1990s, next slide, here's the 2000s. For what it's worth, next slide, here's the first few years of this decade. Temperatures going up pretty much in line with the projections of climate science. Okay. Now, if you happen to not believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, I will try to find common ground with you anyway. And I talk to a lot of crowds where this is true, and the common ground comes from the way that economists think about pollution problems, which is that the way to get less pollution is to make polluting expensive. Because when you make polluting expensive, you get market forces working to promote conservation and innovation and new technologies and all the things that I, at least, love about capitalism. Right, so what I work on as an environmental economist is using the tools of economics and the power of capitalism to protect the environment. Okay? Tools of economics, power of capitalism to protect the environment. A couple of policy tools to talk about, like a carbon tax or an auction cap and trade system, and we're going to hear a little more about those today, but the point of those policy tools is to drive up the price of fossil fuels. This is generally the part in my talk where people stop laughing, right? Because it's hard to convince people that we should be paying more for gasoline and electricity and things like this. But there is a side benefit to these policies other than the main benefit of, like potentially saving the world. He's on like a string or something, right? You just pull it. It's like... And the side benefit of these policies, right, is that they generate a pile of revenue, right? If you have a carbon tax, you generate a pile of revenue. If you have an auction cap and trade system, you generate a pile of revenue. Government can do all sorts of stuff with that revenue. I'm sure you all have your own ideas about what the government can do with a pile of revenue. But the idea that I work on and talk to folks about is that we could be using most or all of that revenue to reduce or eliminate existing taxes. So what's called environmental tax reform or tax shifting or revenue neutral tax swaps. Right? The idea being that if we had higher taxes on things we want less of, like carbon emissions, then we could afford to have lower taxes on things we want more of, like jobs and income and savings and investment. Right? And this is where I find common ground, even with folks like George Will, pretty conservative columnist for the Washington Post. He doesn't believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures. He came to one of my classes a couple of years ago, though, and I asked him if he would support replacing part of the payroll tax, part of the employment tax in this country, with a carbon tax. And he said that he was all for it because he hates the payroll tax. Right? And with unemployment at 7% or whatever it is, I hate the payroll tax. Right? And Al Gore hates the payroll tax. Al Gore says we should tax what we burn and not what we earn. So I asked George Will what he thought about the fact that he and Al Gore agreed on this particular issue. And George Will said, well, he said, an idea should not be held responsible for the people who believe in it. So certainly kind of economists across the political spectrum think this is a good idea, from folks on the left like Paul Krugman to both of Mitt Romney's chief economic advisors, people like Art Laffer, and there's even a place that's done this. So in the views of many economists, myself included, the best climate policy in the world is actually just to our north in the Canadian province of British Columbia, where a right-of-center government said, look, we want to do something about climate change, we want to be market-friendly, we don't want to grow the size of government, so they implemented a revenue-neutral carbon tax. So yes, they pay 30 cents a gallon more for gasoline in British Columbia, 3 cents a kilowatt hour more for coal-fired power, which they don't have too much of, half that for natural gas, 15 cents a therm, $1.50 per million BTU for natural gas. So yes, they pay more for fossil fuels, but they also have the lowest personal income taxes in Canada. They have the lowest corporate income taxes in the G8 group of rich democracies. Really a terrifically successful policy. So I want to share with you a little bit more about sort of carbon pricing policies, which I use as an umbrella term to cover both carbon taxes and cap and trade systems. And next slide, the way I'm going to do that is by sharing with you a couple of slides from my new book, The Cartoon Introduction to Climate Change, which is out. And I don't know whether I'm officially allowed to sell the books here, but if my car is on the way towards coffee, so I can sell them out of my trunk like drugs if you want to get a copy. I also have a couple copies of my cartoon economics book. So next slide, please. So there's a chapter on carbon pricing. So the obvious way to put a price on carbon is with a carbon tax, like the one in British Columbia. Next slide, please. So there's another way to put a price on carbon, and that's with cap and trade. So cap and trade examples include the emissions trading systems in Europe. The California, what's called AB 32, has a cap and trade system. And maybe we'll have time in questions to sort of go into the details of this. And again, there's going to be a panel after the coffee break to discuss all this in more detail. Next slide, please. But what I want to emphasize here is that carbon taxes and cap and trade systems are a lot more similar than they are different. And that it doesn't sound like it, right? In particular, I think that cap and trade often appears to be like magic. Right? Like there's going to be a cap on emissions, and there's going to be trading, and people are going to make money, right? And it doesn't sound like the same thing as carbon taxes, but next slide, please. But economists actually think about them as being very similar, and that's why we use the term carbon pricing to cover both of them. Right? So pretty much anything you do with a carbon tax, you can do with a cap and trade system, and vice versa. So for example, a carbon tax, you generate revenue. With a cap and trade system, you can auction permits and generate revenue for the government. With a cap and trade system, you can do offsets for, if you capture methane in a landfill or on dairy farms. You could also have a tax credit that does the same thing on the carbon tax side of things. So really the easiest way to think about cap and trade, I would argue as an economist, is to just think about it as sort of an oddly shaped kind of carbon tax, and then proceed with the analysis from there. And that's actually how economic analyses of cap and trade systems work. So next slide, please. So this is actually the details of the carbon tax in British Columbia. And it's not nothing, right? So this is roughly 10% of the provincial budget up there. So they take the money, they have a personal income tax credit, they reduce business taxes, they have an offset for low-income households. Really a very smart policy, I would argue. So next slide, please. I'm part of we can look at how this actually worked in British Columbia. So if we look at petroleum sales in BC is in green, Canada as a whole is in blue. My title for this slide is Economics Works. Like when you tax something, people buy less of it. We can also look at the economy. Next slide, please. So the economy in BC is doing just as well as the economy of Canada as a whole. So I would argue really a terrifically successful policy. Next slide, if we want to think about how this might work in Washington State, if we did something similar to British Columbia, and this is the mark that I use, if we had the same kind of carbon tax they have in British Columbia, so let's $5 per ton of CO2 and gradually keep up with inflation and economic growth. Right, so again, that's roughly 25 cents a gallon of gasoline, so I'm not trying to sell you something for nothing. I'm not trying to sell you a free lunch. I'm trying to sell you value for money. Right, because we can take the money from the carbon tax, we can cut the state sales tax by a full percentage point. That may not sound like all that much, but nickels and dimes add up over time. That would save the average household in Washington State hundreds of dollars a year. Right, so in very broad, what I'm proposing, what I'm talking about is let's pay a couple $100 more a year for fossil fuels and a couple $100 less a year for fuels. We could also take some of that money and fund the working families rebate, which is an earned income tax credit offset that benefits low-income working households. And because manufacturers are particularly impacted by carbon tax, we could eliminate the B&O tax, the business tax for manufacturers. So this is a proposal that our group, this Carbon Washington group, is pushing. There are lots of other folks who are also pushing their own ideas. As is keen on climate action. Keith Phillips is here and is going to be on the panel after the coffee break. Some of the views from the governor's office, folks in the legislature have ideas, and this is our particular proposal. So part of what I want to encourage you to do is think about climate policy from a perspective of fiscal policy. Right? Because this is a big deal. This is roughly 10% of the state government budget. Some of you here, to put it in another thing in context here, probably some of you in the room know that there's a sales tax on construction labor, and that's something that folks have in the construction world have been keen to do something about. That's about $400 million a year. Right, so that's something that you could potentially put on the table. So this is, anytime you start talking about tax reform, it becomes complicated, and you get the sense that you're sort of playing with fire. And I think it's true. I think that climate policy is kind of playing with fire. Like, we need to make sure that we do it right, not just because it's fiscal policy playing with fire, but because it's climate policy playing with fire. Right? So I want to finish by talking about why, I've invested a bunch of time and energy into this issue, and why I think climate change is important. And partly it goes back to that, to the idea I shared earlier, right, about if you divide the world up into 5 people, you get a white person, a black person, and 3 Asian people. There's going to be a lot of economic growth around the world in this century, Right, I think that's going to be one of the big stories of this century, and I think the other big story of this century is going to be dealing with the environmental impacts of having 7 billion people on the planet growing to 10 or 11 billion people who are all trying to live the lifestyles that we live here. So next slide, please. If we look at just what's happened already with climate change, this is from the recently released National Climate Assessment. Right, you see that you've had heavy precipitation events increase by 12% already in the Northwest. So this is something that perhaps impacts some of the businesses that you're involved in. That's expected to continue. So the basic climate message when it comes to precipitation is wet gets wetter and dry gets drier. So if you're in a wet place, it's going to get wetter. If you're in a dry place, it's going to get drier. And part of that is that the rainfall that does come is going to come in heavier events, because as the planet warms up, the atmosphere can hold more moisture. So when it rains, you're going to get dumped on you're going to get dumped on more. Next slide, please. Sea level rise. So this graph is actually the sea level rise that we saw in the last century. So starting in 1900, going up through 2000, we saw maybe half a foot, projected to increase 1 to 4 feet of sea level rise by 2100, according to the National Climate Assessment. A lot of that depends on what happens to Greenland, Antarctica, but part of it is also just thermal expansion of seawater. As the planet warms, the water is going to expand just because it gets warmer, in the same way that a hot air balloon expands when you put heat into it. Next slide, please. Stream flow, agriculture, and stream flow issues are going to be a major source of concern in Washington State. So this is the stream flow on the Yakima. Right now, what you see here is that the mountain snowpack acts as sort of this natural reservoir, right, that basically holds onto water that comes down, precipitation that falls in the wintertime, and it releases it when farmers and lots of urban households want that water, which is in sort of, June and July. Right, during the spring and summer months. As we move towards the 2020s, the 2040s, the 2080s, there's going to be less snowfall. It's going to melt off earlier, and so you're going to see stream flow timing is going to shift. There might be the same amount of precipitation. It's going to shift to earlier in the year as there's less snowpack and as that snowpack melts earlier. So definitely a very important thing to think about in terms of urban water systems and also in terms of agriculture. Next slide, please. If you look at forest, or if you look at fires, right, these are acres burned, projected to increase by a factor of 4 by the 2080s. And these are some key areas, places for concern around the Pacific Northwest. Next slide, please. And that's just sort of some of these slides were just things that have happened already in the last century. And if we think about temperature as sort of a guide to what's going to happen, right, we've seen going on 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit already. And depending on what we do, depending on how much carbon we emit and how the planet responds, we might see increases of anywhere from an additional 3 to an additional 6 or 7 degrees Fahrenheit temperature increase over the course of the century. So this is, I would argue, important stuff. And that's why I'm thrilled to be here chatting with you about it this morning and to be part of sort of a community of folks who are all working on this issue. Next slide, please. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I will go back to telling you a few jokes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Although I did this once for a very conservative crowd in Minnesota, and this fellow came up to me at the end of my talk and said that the stuff I said about climate change was the funniest part of my whole routine. Why don't we let's do some Q&A first, and then I'll end with some jokes, and then we can go have coffee. So you have questions about climate policy, about carbon pricing, about any of that stuff? I saw this gentleman's hand here first, then we'll go to the yo. Yes, 1, 2, 3. Yep, so the question was, what can we do in Washington State without China taking action? So that perspective, so Washington State is 1/3 of 1% of global CO2 emissions. And I mean, the most amazing fact that I can give you about climate issues to make you think about how important this is globally is in 2006, China passed the US to be the #1 source of CO2 in the world. In the next year or two, they'll be at double US levels. Right? And even at double US levels, China has 4 times more people than we do. So even at double US levels, they're still at half our levels per capita. So what happens in China, what happens in India, what happens in Africa is going to drive the future of the 21st century in terms of carbon emissions. So what can we do about it here? A couple things. One is, if push comes to shove, if we can push climate policies here, it's not like climate change is going to benefit China. So if we can do things here, then they might be willing to make some sort of deal with us. I think the even more promising story is if we can do technological innovation here, which is what we're really good at, right? If we can develop low carbon technologies, then we can sell them to China and India and the rest of the world. So that's sort of the happiest story that I can tell you about climate change, is if we really get serious about low carbon technologies. And as an economist, I like to think that the free market is the best way to do that, which is why I talk about these sorts of revenue neutral carbon tax ideas. If we get serious about developing low carbon technologies and we can drive the price of renewables down below the price of fossil fuels, then we win, right? Like, then we've in my view at least, we've solved most of the climate challenge. So that's a lot of what I spend my time thinking about. We can actually put up the next slide, which just has my contact information and stuff like this. Gentleman in the back there. Checks and balances in place to make sure taxes actually go in the right place. Well, our group is we're hoping to run a ballot measure, so we can actually say in the ballot measure, this is what we're going to do. And then I think that, there's concern about, well, maybe the state legislature would just raise the sales tax back up the next year. But if you look at the history of the sales tax in Washington State, for example, the state sales tax rate has stayed the same since 1983. Right? I was 10. So there's actually a fair amount of stability in tax systems. But ultimately, I think it's a matter of folks in a democracy sort of making sure that if we ask for it to be revenue neutral, then it ends up being revenue neutral. The only other thing I'd add on that is that, to come back to this gentleman's point over here, I think that it's in the self-interest of folks on the left or the Greens or however you want to call it to make sure that it is revenue neutral, because I would argue that a revenue neutral carbon tax is probably the most attractive idea nationally if we're going to have to get some bipartisan kind of climate action. And if we do it in one state like Washington and it's not revenue neutral, then we're going to kill it. Right? And the point of this policy is not to solve climate change in Washington State, but to set an example for the nation. Yes. Yeah, so the question was about what happens if the policy succeeds in reducing carbon emissions, then we don't have any revenue anymore, then how do you maintain revenue stability? So in the long term, like in the 50, 100-year time frame, I think you're correct. Right? But in the long term, we're going to have to do some revenue changes anyway. So for example, the gas tax, as you said, is sort of drying up as a way of paying for highway spending. The first gas tax in the nation, in the world, I think perhaps even, was in Oregon in like 1919. Right? So 100 years ago, there were no gas taxes. 100 years from now, there will probably be no gas taxes. But we'll have to do something to fund highways. So in the long run, there's going to have to be some sort of revenue reform anyway. In the short run, the good news from a revenue perspective, the challenging news from a climate perspective is that getting off of fossil fuels is not going to be easy. Right? What British Columbia saw was a 10 or 15% reduction in CO2 emissions. That's what we'll see if we do that in Washington State. And I feel very confident that we'll have revenue stability for a couple of decades. Right? Once you start getting into 2050 or beyond that, then it's a little more questionable. But at least if we happen to get off of carbon emissions, at least we've solved this climate problem, right? So that's not a bad result. Yes. So what's happening in this country? So there aren't really, I think carbon tax policies, I think probably what we have in Washington and folks are talking about in Oregon is probably the farthest along that carbon taxes are. There are cap and trade systems. There's a cap and trade system in California. There's a cap and trade system on the East Coast called RGGI. I was actually just out there in a conference yesterday talking with public utility commissioners in New England. Those people are wild. I think that those policies I feel like have gone okay. The East Coast policy, I would argue, is pretty weak. So when I look at a cap and trade policy, as an economist, I judge it by the permit price, because that's essentially the same thing as the carbon tax rate. The permit price in RGGI on the East Coast has been about $2 per ton of CO2. Now they've reduced the number of permits they give out, so now it's like $5 per ton of CO2. But if you compare that to $30 per ton of CO2 in British Columbia, right, $2, $5, that's not a very strong policy. They do take the revenue from that, and apparently they do pretty good things with it in terms of investing in energy efficiency options. California has a little bit of a stronger carbon price. It's $10 per ton of CO2. Again, a third of what British Columbia has. What I worry about a little bit with cap and trade, and California is expanding their policy to cover transportation fuel starting in January. So there's going to be a 10 to 15 cent a gallon gas price increase in California because of the climate policy. It will be interesting to see how that plays out politically. And it will also be interesting to see if California does a good job of spending the revenue. And that's something I actually worry about quite a bit with cap and trade systems, because the money sort of comes in from auction sales, and so it doesn't go through what I would consider to be sort of the standard budgetary channels. And so I've started describing it as sort of like the Guantanamo Bay of fiscal policy. Right, like it's sort of extraterritorial, and so like the governor in California is going to take a bunch of the money and spend it on this high-speed rail between a high-speed train between San Francisco and Los Angeles that is very controversial. So it's entirely possible that California could take billions of dollars a year and waste them, which is not good in my view. Yes, sir. Can we go back to the GDP slide from British Columbia? So GDP in British Columbia is doing just as well as, I think it's a couple more slides back, doing just as well as Canada as a whole. And in fact, there's actually a study that suggests that shifting from, this slide, yes, thank you, that shifting from, that the carbon tax is actually going to benefit the economy of British Columbia, basically because personal and corporate income taxes are a bigger drag on the economy than the carbon tax would be. So if you think about a carbon tax, the carbon tax is sort of like a sales tax or a consumption tax. And economists think that it's generally a pretty good idea to increase taxes on consumption and reduce taxes on investment and labor. And that's basically what this is. You can think about it. Impacts on employment, I think, as far as I know, the impacts on employment in British Columbia, I mean, it's hard to tease out what's happened because of the carbon tax with what happened because of the carbon tax went into effect in 2008, and you may recall that a couple other things happened in the world economy in 2008. So it's hard to tease that out, but I will say that both political parties in British Columbia are happy with the carbon tax. Not happy with it in the sense of like, hey, I'm going to Disneyland happy, because this is taxes, right? But happy in the sense of, you know, hey, I went to the dentist and everything's okay, kind of happy. Let me tell you a couple of final jokes, and then I'm happy to chat afterwards. And thank you all for these great questions. And if you want to send me an email, then I'm happy to continue the conversation over coffee or over email. I am happy to say, ladies and gentlemen, that it has been a big year for economics comedy. That was not a punchline, but thank you. I got to be on the PBS NewsHour. Yes. Now I don't know how much you all know about the world of stand-up comedy, but let me just tell you this. In the world of stand-up comedy, ladies and gentlemen, it does not get any bigger than the PBS NewsHour. Jim Lair. I've been getting phone calls nonstop on my rotary dial telephone. It was actually pretty amazing. They interviewed 3 economists on this show. They interviewed Robert Shiller, who won the Nobel Prize. They interviewed Joseph Stiglitz, who won the Nobel Prize. And they interviewed me. I felt like kind of a self-aware version of Sarah Palin. And what did they ask me? My moment of TV fame on the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lair, they asked me if I'd ever bombed on stage. All right, now a couple of things about this. First of all, I am not afraid of failure. I'm an economist. Secondly, I'm a professional comedian, right? So if a joke doesn't work, you just sort of keep throwing stuff out there until you find something that sticks, which is basically the same thing that the Fed and the Treasury have been doing for the last couple of years. Finally, I had to admit on the PBS NewsHour that, in fact, I had bombed on stage. The worst show I ever did was in October of 2008. You remember what was happening to the stock market and the world economy in October of 2008? It looked like we were going back into the Great Depression. October of 2008, I did a show in Colorado Springs for a group of bankers. Yeah. Now, I'm not allowed to tell you which bank it was because I signed a non-disclosure agreement. But let me just say that if you wanted to figure out which bank it was, it wouldn't be, well, so far to go. Just making sure you're still awake. Anyway, comedy is kind of a violent business, all right? If you're doing well, then you're killing. And if you're doing badly, then you're bombing. And I totally bombed that show, and I actually spent a fair amount of time afterwards sort of soul-searching, like trying to figure out where had I lost the connection with this audience of bankers in Colorado Springs in October of 2008. And I finally realized that I lost them on my opening line. And my opening line was, Hey, how's it going? Thank you all for inviting me to come out and join you this morning. I look forward to continuing the conversation. I'm turning it back over to Barbara.